Before I start, I'll just say a little bit about myself. My name is Dän Zigmond. I'm a Zen Buddhist priest. I'm transmitted as a teacher in the Zen Buddhist tradition. My teacher was Kobuncino Otagawa Roshi. He came to help start Tassajara, which was the first Zen monastery in the West. Not too far from here, maybe about a couple hours away in the mountains near Carmel. He was trained as a traditional Japanese Zen monk, and so part of why he was invited here was because he knew how to use all the bells and other things that you're supposed to have at a traditional temple. But when he got here, he sort of fell in love with the chaotic American spirit and only spent a couple years at this monastery. And after that, started more informal temples around the United States, including one in the Santa Cruz Mountains, actually quite close to here, called Jikoji. And that's where I was ordained. And now, Kobun passed away about 22 years ago. Now I'm one of the teachers at Jikoji, this little Zen temple in the hills above Silicon Valley. But although I've been a Zen priest for many years, more than 25 now, I also work in technology. I have a family. I lead, in many ways, a pretty normal life. I've written a couple books on meditation and daily life, and I continue to balance my practice of Zen with work, family life, and many other things. And I hope that's what we can all talk about and practice together today. So in terms of the schedule for the day, it's a little loose. This morning, I'll talk a bit about meditation. I think you've all had some experience with meditation already. And then we'll meditate together. I'll leave time for question and answer. Your questions are really important to me because I want to make sure that I'm talking about things that are relevant to you. After lunch, I understand we'll take a hike together and then come back again and do a little more meditation and discussion. And hopefully together, just really explore connecting the spiritual and the material. That's at least our plan. Before I get started on talking about meditation, I am curious, is there anyone who had not meditated before coming here this weekend? The interesting thing about Zen meditation in particular, it's very simple. I mean, the instructions, which I'll give in a little bit, they take, like a minute or two. They're very straightforward. But something can be simple and difficult at the same time. And I think that's one of the lessons of Zen. Something doesn't have to be complicated to be hard or to be important. There are, of course, many meditation traditions. Almost every spiritual tradition has some sort of tradition of meditation, whether Christianity, Judaism, Islam, Hinduism. It's hard to find a faith that doesn't have some sort of contemplative practice, at least at some point in its history. My training is in the Zen Buddhist tradition, and I just thought I should say a little bit about the Buddha. We are here in a Buddhist temple, but Buddha lived about 2,500 years ago, as far as we can tell. Grew up, practiced, taught in a very, very different place. So much of what we take for granted now, of course, didn't exist then. Not only did he live before screens and devices, he lived before paper. And so I think it's reasonable to ask why we should pay attention, why we should care about what someone taught in such a different world. And I think the answer is that Buddha discovered something important. He discovered that awakening is possible. So what does this mean? Well, in very simple terms, I think many of us go through life sort of half asleep, going through the motions. For some of us, this happens especially in our work, but it can also happen at home, at school, with our families and friends. And it's kind of terrible. It can be deeply unfulfilling. We have this sense that our lives are passing us by without us really living them. So what Buddha discovered was that it doesn't have to be this way, that there is another way to live. Buddha was born in what is now Nepal to a sort of minor royal family and was raised as a prince. So then he saw what we now call the fourth sight. He saw this wandering holy man that you used to have a lot in India, and I think still have a little bit. Just somebody dressed in rags who was just wandering around doing these different spiritual practices with no home, no possessions, no family. And he decided that that's what I'll do. I have to just now follow a spiritual path. So he went back very briefly to the palace, think he cut off his hair, he got rid of his fancy clothes, and he just disappeared off into the Indian countryside. Again, if you have kids yourself or remember your own childhood, you might appreciate this impulse, but having decided that the life his parents had planned for him, this life of total pleasure, having decided that that was a dead end, having rejected that, he decided now he would just try the opposite. He would just do the exact opposite of what his parents had wanted for him. And so instead of chasing pleasure, he decided to chase, and he became a wandering ascetic, someone who just tries these incredibly difficult practices, just pushing his body as far as he possibly could. So this included all kinds of very, very difficult practices like extreme fasting, where he would survive on a single grain of rice per day. And it's said that he got so thin that you could count his ribs from behind. And he tried practices like holding his breath for minutes and minutes on end. And it's said that at some point he held his breath so long, his skin all turned gray, and even the gods thought he was dead. And he just pushed himself and pushed himself for years. I can't remember now, 6, 7 years, until eventually he realized he had pushed himself almost to the point of death, and that if he continued much longer, he would surely just die. And that instead of coming up with a way to overcome suffering or to transcend suffering, all he had really accomplished was making himself suffer more. And so if he continued, he would die, having never found the answer to his great question. At that moment, he was fortunate that a young woman passed by who had been out milking cows, and she saw his sort of pathetic figure on the side of the road, clearly near death, and offered him some milk. So he accepted this, the first real food he had had in many, many months. And this gave him the strength to try something different. He decided instead of continuing to torture himself, he would just find a quiet spot. He found a tree, what we now call the Bodhi tree, and he would just sit, and meditate, reflect, and he would not leave that spot until he had found his answer to overcoming suffering. So he sat all the rest of that day, he sat all through the night, and in the early, early morning hours, he saw the morning star start to rise in the sky. And seeing that morning star, he had his moment of great awakening. And his awakening, his realization, his enlightenment, was that the way to overcome suffering was what he called the middle way. It was not wallowing in suffering, inviting suffering, as he had been doing as an ascetic, but it was also not running away from suffering and avoiding all suffering, as he had been doing as a prince. But it was something in the middle. And that's what we're going to practice today, this middle way. To be comfortable, but not too comfortable. To find this middle way, we have to pay attention. And that's really what our practice of meditation. The style of meditation that we'll practice together today is usually called mindfulness meditation. And mindfulness is sort of a fancy word in English. It wasn't used very much in English until a couple of decades ago. But in Pali, in the language of the Buddha, it's not a fancy word at all. It's a tiny little word, sati. And it's the same word that's used to just mean remembering. So you can think about mindfulness as literally just remembering the present, remembering what's happening right now. And meditation is just the way we practice mindfulness. I think of this as just like when you're learning to drive. I had the experience of teaching someone to drive just a couple of summers ago. And what we did is, I think, what you almost always do when you're learning to drive. You take a car and you go to an empty parking lot and you just practice. You practice starting, stopping, turning, going straight. And we don't do this because it's so useful to know how to drive in an empty parking lot. Once you've had some practice, you may never drive in an empty parking lot again. But we do it this way because we want to simplify things. We limit our distractions. We don't want other pressures. We don't want to be late for work or have some passenger complaining. And meditation is sort of the same thing. We find a quiet spot like this room. We don't have any other things on the agenda. And we literally just practice paying attention without trying to do anything else. And so that's what we're going to do today. As I mentioned before, Zen meditation is quite simple. There are other forms of meditation that ask you to do more complicated things with your mind or your breath, that ask you to imagine an image or recite a certain word. Zen practice there's a certain purity to it. In Japanese, we refer to it as shikantaza, just sitting. We are just sitting and paying attention to that act of just sitting without trying to do anything else, without adding anything to that experience. We do pay a bit of attention to our posture. We try to sit upright, whether you're on a cushion or on a chair, with our back straight and our shoulders back. And there are lots of reasons for this. I think in part it's better for our bodies. It's when we are sitting for longer periods of time, we can hurt our back if we're slunched over. But also that little extra effort of trying to stay upright helps keep us present, keep us paying attention, keep us from daydreaming. Traditionally, we would sit either cross-legged like this, or we would kneel. I'll just demonstrate what that looks like. Again, you keep the cushion under you so you don't put too much pressure on your ankles. So you can sit like this as well. But some way where you have your back relatively straight, your spine supported. When you sit cross-legged, you can either have both legs on the ground, or what I usually do is what's called the half lotus, with one foot against my thigh. If you're very flexible and have been doing lots of yoga, you can do full lotus, but I don't do that. And that's where you have both feet up on your thighs. With our hands, we usually place our right hand in our lap, our left hand on top, and lightly touch our thumbs to make a sort of circle. And that circle has become a sort of symbol of Zen. And so you'll see that that's what I do while we're meditating. While we're meditating, I'll go around and help with this posture, because particularly when we close our eyes, it's often hard to have a sense of whether we're sitting upright or not. So I will help you find that upright posture. It's a little bit like learning a sport, like learning golf or tennis or baseball, where you have to sort of develop a muscle memory of what it feels like in your body to sit in this way. My hope is that once you have that memory in your body, in your muscles, you can continue to sit upright when you sit on your own. So once we're in our upright posture, I'll ring the bell 3 times for us to start. Just sound like this. And when I ring the bell, I recommend you just listen to the sound of the bell. Listen to it until you can't hear it any longer. And then bring your attention to your breathing, paying attention to each in-breath and each out-breath. I often get lots of questions about breathing. How should we breathe? Should we breathe from our chest or our stomach, from our mouth or our nose, long or short, fast or slow? And there are meditation teachers who give very specific instructions for breathing. And there's whole books about breathing now. But I really try not to do this. What I want you to do is simply be aware of your breathing, to pay attention to each breath. Part of what we're learning in this practice is how to pay attention to something, to notice something, without trying to change it, without trying to control it. So pay attention to what feels natural to you. How do you breathe when you're not trying to breathe in any special way? And you can just take a moment to do that now. Just notice your breath exactly as it is. When we're not meditating, it's sometimes helpful to just put a hand on your chest or maybe midway to help you notice where you're breathing. And then once you've noticed it, you can take your hand away and see if you can maintain that awareness of your natural breath, noticing where your breath comes from and where it goes. So in just a moment, we'll do a period of meditation together. But before we do, I just thought perhaps I would pause and see if there are any questions before we actually jump into the practice.
Yeah, quick question. So you were talking about Buddha, but at the same time you were talking about Zen meditation, and
yes.
It came from Japan, right?
Mm-hmm.
So how they connect to each other?
question was, what is the connection between Zen, and I mentioned that my teacher came from Japan, and Buddha, who I mentioned grew up in India. After Buddha passed away, his students began spreading his teachings, and we'll talk more about that later in the day, but they traveled first south to southern India and across the water to what's now Sri Lanka, and then also to the east, to Burma, Thailand, Cambodia. And you still find the oldest forms of Buddhism practiced in those places, in Sri Lanka, Burma, Thailand. But then they also went north into China and eventually Tibet. So this center here was started by Tibetan Buddhists who practiced the tradition that developed in Tibet after the original Buddhist teachings were passed there. In China, Buddhism changed a lot when it came into contact with the other Chinese traditional religions like Taoism and other things that were being practiced in China. And Zen first emerged as a school of Buddhism there. Zen, that word, is a Japanese word, and that's the Japanese pronunciation of a Chinese word, and the Chinese word is the Chinese pronunciation of a Sanskrit, so an Indian word, that originally just means meditation. So as Buddhism spread, it got, sort of complicated, and there were lots of different schools of Buddhism that developed. That doesn't seem to be what the Buddha himself wanted. Gave his students lots of rules for how he thought they should practice and live, and one of those rules was not to split off into separate schools, but to keep Buddhism as one thing, but that didn't work out. So there ended up being lots of different schools that focused on lots of different things, some elaborate ceremonies and some that really focused on studying the scriptures. So as I said, Zen Buddhism basically means meditation Buddhism. So this was an attempt to try to go all the way back to the original teachings and just focus very, very much on meditation. So it's sort of the branch of Buddhism that's most focused on meditation. So even though you see meditation, like they practice meditation here in the Tibetan tradition, they practice meditation in other Buddhist schools, Zen was the school that was completely focused on meditation. And so that developed in China, but from China it spread to Japan, Korea, Vietnam, and as I said, ultimately to America, Europe, beyond. So we'll start with a very short meditation. I should say, so I'll ring 3 times for us to start, as I said. Then at the end, there's 2 different ways we'll end. Sometimes we'll do kind of back-to-back periods of meditation where we'll end, but just so you can stretch or take a drink of water or something, and then we'll meditate again. So if we're doing that, if there's another period of meditation coming, so you should stay more or less in your place and not talk, then I'll ring the bell 2 times to signal the end of the first period, but we're going to have another period coming very soon. Well, let's begin. So find your upright posture. See if you can find a posture with your back straight, your shoulders back. You can either cast your gaze down just a few feet in front of you, or in a room that's a little bit bright like this. Sometimes it's easiest just to close your eyes entirely. That's, I think, what most people will do. Your hands in your lap, or if you prefer, you can put them on your thighs or knees, but somewhere where they won't cause you to slouch over one way or the other. Traditional Zen meditation is silent, but I will give some instruction, some guidance as we sit. Although we'll do some silent periods later in the day. You don't need to control your breath in any way. You don't need to match your breathing to my breathing, or to any fixed idea of how your breathing should be. Just notice each breath exactly as it is, giving your full attention to each in-breath and each out-breath. Part of why I come around and help you with your posture is so that you learn just what it feels like. And I think that's the main way, to just try to be fully aware of your body, to notice the difference when I help adjust you. I mean, in the end, you have to sit the way you want to sit. But I want you to have the experience of what it feels like to sit upright. People often ask, why it's important, why bother trying to sit upright? And again, partly it just is this practice of paying attention to everything, so paying attention to our bodies, to our breath. But also, I think our posture can serve as like an early warning sign of what's happening in our minds. So for example, when you start to slump forward, that often means you're starting to fall asleep. And if your head starts to go back, that often means you're starting to daydream. So I sometimes notice these things in my body before I notice them in my mind. So I notice my head going forward before I notice that I'm getting sleepy and starting to drift into sleep. Or I notice my head tilting back before I notice that I'm starting to daydream. So just developing that habit of paying attention to our bodies helps us learn to pay attention to our minds. I hope that's helpful. Other questions in the room? Well, I got a few questions during the break that I thought I would talk about before we do some more meditation. Oh, so one very basic thing, why am I wearing this bib? So this, in the Zen tradition, this is my license to teach. You can see on the back, my teacher has written some things in it and put his stamp. So when you first ordain as a Zen priest, you actually sew this by hand. And when you first ordain, you sew a black one, and your teacher writes something in it, gives you a Buddhist name. And then when you complete your training, you sew a brown one like this, and your teacher again writes something in it. So this brown, what's called a rakusu, is sort of my license to teach. And it's modeled after the robes that Buddhists wore. So in the ancient Buddhist traditions, you weren't allowed to wear regular clothes once you became a monastic, and you would sew your own robe from rags. And so you can see this is sewn from lots of little pieces. So it's the same sort of pattern that Buddhist monks used to sew their main robes from. So it's just symbolic of that connection to that lineage. Another question I got is sort of what is my own daily practice and what do I recommend for daily practice? I do think it is best to practice every day. And it's much more important to me that you find a time of day and a length of time that you can do every day. That's more important than any particular routine. The most traditional times to practice are first thing in the morning or last thing at night. I usually practice first thing in the morning. That's always been my routine. I talked about how, Buddha practiced all through the night and into the morning. So I think that's why late at night and early morning became the traditional times to practice. For me, the mornings were the easiest time because that was the part of my day I could completely control. So even when I had young children, even babies and toddlers, I could always decide to just wake up before them and have this time to myself. So it was the one time of day that was completely mine. But other people find it easier to practice at night or even, at lunch. Or the most important thing is just to find a time of day that works for you. And then in terms of how long to practice, His Holiness, the Dalai Lama, he practices several hours, I think 3, 4, 5 hours of meditation every day. And he's been doing that every day, I think since he was a toddler. So for, close to 80 years. And still, tomorrow when he wakes up, he'll decide, I think I should spend 4 hours meditating. So he still thinks there's some value to continuing, which is just a way of saying, I don't know that you can practice too much, but I'm also not sure you can practice too little. I think if your schedule is very full and you're finding it difficult to find time, that even just practicing for 5 minutes every day is very beneficial. When people ask me, for my advice, usually I say maybe try doing 10 minutes a day, every day. I find that 10 minutes is a length of time that most of us can find in our day without too much effort, without feeling we have to schedule it in our calendars and things like that. Most of us can either wake up 10 minutes earlier or maybe go to work 10 minutes later. When it starts getting much longer than that, 15, 20 minutes, people start to feel like they have to schedule it. 10 minutes is not much longer than most of us take in the shower, and we manage to do that, without too much effort. So I think it's a good place to start. But again, I would much rather you practice 5 minutes a day every day than, set the aspiration of practicing, for 30 or 60 minutes every day, but not actually do it. Consistency is really the most important thing, making this just part of your daily life. Another question I got during the break was, I mentioned Buddha's awakening and talk about awakening. So what is awakening, or what does it feel like? And I think about awakening as more an experience that we have. It's not a yes or no thing. They're not people who are awakened and people who are not awakened. It's an experience, and I think it's an experience probably most of us have had at some point. One way I think about it is thinking about a spectrum of our mental state, our consciousness. So you can imagine one point of the spectrum is just our ordinary waking lives, just how we are feeling maybe right now, or on a typical day at work, something like that. So that's awake. And then you can imagine another point on the spectrum, which is asleep. Just how you feel, maybe how you felt last night, how you feel when you're asleep. Awake, asleep. Now, I think for most of us, if we reflect a little, we have had some experiences in between. So maybe shortly before you fall asleep, your mind is starting to drift. Maybe you're even having some sort of dreamlike thoughts. You're not really awake. But on the other hand, if I were to walk into your room or say your name, say Dan, you would respond. You're also not really asleep. So maybe we could call that half asleep. And then there's other states. Maybe you've been in, having a long day, meetings or something, or you're very bored, starting to sort of daydream, and you're not really paying attention to what's going on around you. But again, if there was a loud noise, if someone were to say your name, you would respond. So you're not really paying attention, but you're also definitely not asleep. You could call that sort of half awake. So you have awake, half asleep, asleep. Then if you think about it, there are some states that are sort of, in my chart here, to the left of asleep. So for example, maybe sometimes you're in a very deep sleep. So even if I were to come and shake you, you might not wake up right away. Adults don't go into this state very often, but teenagers do, where it's hard to wake them up. So that would be asleep, then deep asleep. And then of course there are states like being unconscious or in a coma, where you can't be woken up. You're unconscious. So now we've got awake, half asleep, asleep, deeply asleep, unconscious. So now the question is, what does this spectrum look like over on this side? If we were to say, take half a step to the right of awake, what is it like? Well, we know what it's like to be more asleep than asleep. What is it like to be more awake than awake? And I think if you reflect a little, if you think about your own life, I bet that you've had that experience at some point. There was a moment in your life, maybe many moments in your life, where you felt more awake than awake. For some people, it's maybe playing a sport where they just feel completely engaged. They know everything that's happening without even thinking about it. For some people, it's when they fall in love and suddenly everything seems more bright, more clear. And sometimes it just comes out of nowhere. Maybe you're driving your car and you have this moment where everything just feels right. Everything just feels clear. I think of those moments of being extra awake, more awake, being fully present. Those are moments of awakening. There's some controversy among Buddhists. The word Buddha, that's not his name. His name was Siddhartha. That's a title. And the title means the one who is awake, the awakened one. And there's some controversy. Was Buddha always in that state of awakening? And I tend to think no. If you read some of Buddha's lectures that he gave, he sometimes talks about things like, when I'm experiencing awakening, I experience this. When I'm experiencing awakening, I experience that. So that suggests that even Buddha was not always in that state of hyper awareness. But there do seem to be a couple things that happen when we practice meditation. One is that we develop this sort of muscle of attention. And when we learn how to pay attention, maybe we get into this state of full attention even more. But the other thing is, maybe we just notice it more when it happens. That we all are sort of drifting in and out of awakening all the time. But because we're not paying attention, we miss it. So the idea is not that we sort of chase after awakening exactly, but that we learn to appreciate it when it comes. We learn in a way to appreciate everything that arises, to pay attention to our whole being. And maybe that's a good time for us to do a little more meditation together. I wonder if other thoughts or questions have come up as we've done this sitting together. I think our practice is just to notice the breath exactly as it is. You may find that as you practice more, that your breath starts to change, and that's fine. You just notice that. You also might find it doesn't change. Our practice is just the practice of paying attention and really of letting go of control. I notice for myself that my breathing will often slow down during meditation, or that it might be more quick and shallow when I'm upset or agitated. But the goal is not to get our breath to one state or another, but just to learn to notice it, to pay attention to our breathing, and through that, to learn to pay attention to everything. There are many meditation techniques. I mentioned that there's many different meditation traditions around the world, but even within Buddhism, there's many techniques that are taught. I just really like the simplicity of the Zen approach where, the instructions are almost trivial. The idea is that we're really not adding anything to this practice of just sitting. So we're paying attention to our breath. In a sense, you can decide what that means. That might mean literally trying to pay attention to the flow of air itself, but also the physical sensations, where it enters your mouth or nose, the feeling of your chest rising, falling. With time, we start paying attention to all of it. We develop this attention muscle. And with time, it becomes quite strong. But yes, in other traditions, we're given more specific guidance of what it means to pay attention to our breath or which part of our breath to pay attention to. Zen just tries to keep things very simple. Other questions or thoughts about this style of meditation? Sometimes we don't know why we have different experiences with meditation. I have this myself, where there are days where meditation feels very good. There are days where it feels very difficult. There are days where my mind gets very calm. There are days when it's very agitated. And our practice is just to pay attention, to notice how we feel each day, but even more each moment. And of course, it's nicer to meditate when we're feeling good. It's more pleasant. But we try not to chase after any particular experience, to just notice each experience exactly as it is. That said, I do think almost everything, maybe even everything in life, does get easier with practice. And so, if you have been meditating for a few days, as you have, it's not a surprise that maybe it's a little easier today than it was a couple days ago. But again, our practice is just to notice those changes without maybe thinking too much about them. Notice each experience. And through that, develop this muscle of paying attention. Well, I do think it's important not to get too attached to these feelings. If we commit ourselves to practice, as we're doing today, we'll have all kinds of experiences, and some will be very joyful, and some will be very difficult. Part of why I tell the story of Buddha's life is because he tried these two approaches, trying to always feel good, and in a way trying to always feel bad. And neither one, in the end, was very fulfilling, was very helpful. What was fulfilling was just experiencing each thing, each moment, exactly as it is. So when we do that, we will notice that we have moments of bliss, of happiness. But we will also have moments of difficulty and sadness. And we try not to get too hung up on either one. Not chasing suffering and not running from suffering, but just living in the middle. Before I jump into talking again, I just thought I would see if there's other questions that have arisen while we were apart or even during that meditation. Our practice is to pay attention to whatever arises. So we don't try to remember certain things or try to focus on certain memories. But when these memories arise, we pay attention to them. Sometimes these are memories of very difficult periods. In much of our life, sometimes we try not to remember certain things. So we're pushing things away or pushing them down. This could be childhood trauma, like you said, but even small things, a fight that we're having or someone who's broken our heart. And it's very difficult to think about and remember, and so we try to avoid it. But in meditation, we don't try to avoid anything. We commit ourselves to just noticing whatever arises. And so it's not uncommon to have things arise that we've been trying to avoid. When that happens, we don't do anything special. We just notice those feelings or those memories. We give them our full attention, and then we give our full attention to whatever arises next. We're getting to the end of our day. I thought this might be a good time to talk about balance. Buddha himself was not very good at relationships. One thing I left out of the story of his life that I told this morning is that when he made the decision to follow the spiritual path and leave the palace, he wasn't single. He abandoned his wife and child in order to follow that path. He avoided most of what we think of as balance by just avoiding both work and home life. When we think about the life of a monk, the monastic life, they wake up very early in the morning, they meditate for many hours during the day. It sometimes sounds very difficult, but Buddha didn't think of it as difficult. Buddha thought monastic life was easy. He thought what you're doing is difficult. What's difficult is combining practice with all these other real-world responsibilities. He thought the life of a monk just focusing only on meditation and practice, that was the easy path. He said in one of his lectures, home life is a confinement, while monastic life is like an open space. And maybe your life can feel like a confinement sometimes, with so many different demands on your time. But I do think this is one place where we can aspire to be better than Buddha. From the very beginning, Buddha understood that not everyone could follow the monastic path and become a monk or a nun. He always had lay followers as well, everyone from royalty to slaves. And he was very clear that anyone could realize awakening. And many of these people had responsibilities that they couldn't give up, as I'm sure you do. Finding balance in our life is not easy. People talk a lot these days about work-life balance, but I don't really like that phrase because it suggests that we're just trying to balance two things. But life is more complicated than that. We have to balance many, many things. Work, family, friends, sleep, exercise, food, meditation. And these time trade-offs are difficult because where we spend our time makes a difference. Sometimes I feel the difference between my closest friends and people who are just acquaintances is not how naturally connected we are or how much we have in common, but it's really who I've spent the most time with. We all have people in our lives who we like but we've never become close to, and maybe others who are very close even though it doesn't seem like we have a lot in common. And sometimes the difference is just how much time we've invested in each relationship. And this happens with work as well, of course. People sometimes ask me how I've kept up this Zen practice while having a demanding job. And the truth is that there have been trade-offs. I certainly have colleagues who have been more successful than me, and I think it's in part that they just put in more time. And there are certainly also Zen students who became teachers much faster than me. It took me 22 years to officially complete my Zen training. And that's partly that Zen is hard, but it's also partly that for most of that time I had a job, a wife, and I raised 2 kids. When my kids were small, I woke up with them each morning. I was the one who took them to school, and I tried to be home for dinner. And that meant if there was a meeting before 9 or after 6, I usually missed it. And some of those missed meetings had consequences. How much we accomplish is partly a function of how much time we put in. It's possible that I would be more successful now if I hadn't been so strict about getting home for dinner or hadn't taken time off to do retreats. But at the same time, I think I've been successful enough. Finding the right balance is difficult, and it will look different for you than it does for me, and it will change over time. Now my kids have both left home, so that's one less thing demanding my time, but I'm also trying to teach more, so that's a new thing demanding my time. And so my own balance has shifted. I think the key is 2 things. First, the balance between work and home is easiest when you're basically happy. If you like your work and you like your home life, you'll naturally want to spend as much time as possible in both places. And this creates a sort of healthy tension. Your incentives are all aligned. On the other hand, if you're feeling miserable in one place or the other, or even worse, in both places, then it will be very hard to be happy with any trade-off. But second, you really have to pay attention. As hard as it is to find the right balance in life, it's almost impossible to just happen on it by luck. You have to experiment, and you have to pay attention to the results. Decide what's important to you, and devote your time accordingly. Try not to let anyone else make these choices for you. And if you don't like the results of your choice, if you're feeling frustrated at work or at home or elsewhere, then make an adjustment. Keep looking for that balance. Even after you find it, keep looking, Because it moves. Meditation is relevant here for two reasons. First, and I guess this is the bad news, meditation can become one more thing that competes for our time. It can feel like one more chore that we have to squeeze into the day. But second, and I think this is the good news, the attention that we develop in meditation helps us find this balance. As I said, you can't find this balance without paying attention. You're really not going to just stumble on it by accident. It's a deliberate choice, and we can only inform that choice by paying attention to cause and effect. We have a limited time on earth, and we don't even know how limited until it's over. And this means we can't do everything. But by paying attention, we can make every moment count. I also want to talk a little about change. I think many of us come to an event like this because we want to experience change. But change can also be very frightening. I mentioned that Buddha lived, before these devices that we carry around, of course, but also, of course, before any kind of recording, and even before paper. If you think about what that meant, it meant the only way to remember something was just literally to remember it. So you might wonder how we know all these lectures that he gave. And we know because his students would memorize them. Now, in part, people's memories were better back then because they had to be. Again, that was the only way to remember anything. You couldn't make notes. You had to just remember things. But Buddha also tried to make it easier to remember his lectures in a couple of ways. He often spoke in verse because it seems that verse is somehow easier to remember. But he also used lots and lots of lists. So his teachings are filled with lists. I talked about the Four Noble Truths, but there's many others. The Holy Eightfold Path. If you go and you read the scriptures, there's just many, many lists like this. One of my favorite of these lists are what he called the 3 characteristics of existence. These are the 3 things you see anywhere you look. And these 3 in Pali were anicca, dukkha, and anatta, or in English we would say impermanence, suffering, and no self. Impermanence, suffering, and no self. Impermanence, that nothing lasts forever. Suffering, that we already talked about. And no self, that there isn't inside us some permanent, unchanging thing. We hear about suffering the most. I talked about it this morning, and we'll talk about it again. And of course, many people come to meditation, as I said, because they're concerned with suffering. There's something in their life making them unhappy, some pain that they want to overcome. And Buddha was the same way. It was his witness to suffering that set him on the spiritual path. He saw those 4 signs: sickness, old age, and death. And then the wandering holy man. Again, another list. But these 3 things, impermanence, suffering, and no self, are all connected and are really 3 ways of talking about the same thing. And for me, it's no surprise that he started this list with anicca, impermanence. Impermanence in English is this big word, but it really just means change, that everything changes. And this is actually what anatta, no self, means as well. It's not that we don't exist. Of course we do. If I didn't exist, I couldn't be here talking to you. It's that we don't exist as some unchanging thing. You might think you're the same you who was here yesterday or last year, but you're not. Every moment is different. Every moment is unique. And in each of those moments, there's a different you. And in many ways, this is what dukkha, or suffering, is about too. Because change can be frightening. Much of suffering comes from fighting change. I talked earlier about these 3 kinds of suffering: not getting what we want, getting what we don't want, losing what we have. If you think about that, 1 of those is about wanting change, and 2 of those are about fighting change. Buddhists often call this resistance to change clinging. We cling to what we have, or what we want, or what we think we want, and this clinging causes us to suffer. I mentioned the 4 Noble Truths this morning, but I only told you the first one, that life is suffering. The second Noble Truth is that the cause of suffering is this clinging, or what's sometimes called desire. And the third is that the way to end suffering is to end this clinging, to end desire. And the fourth is that the path to end that suffering, to end that desire, is the middle way, is finding that balance, to stop fighting change. Because change can be liberating. It's the one thing we can count on. And that's a big deal. We don't know what the world will be like next year, tomorrow, or even in the very next moment. But we do know that it will be different than it is right now. That change is the only certainty. When you're sitting in meditation, as we've been sitting here today, it can be scary to think about all the time we still have to sit. But the one thing you know for sure is that those other periods of meditation will be different than this one. In fact, the very next moment will be different from this moment. Just because we're struggling now doesn't mean we'll be struggling in 10 minutes or 5 minutes, or even in the very next moment. Because every moment is a fresh chance. And once we accept that change is inevitable, it becomes less frightening. We might be afraid to switch jobs or start a new business because we're scared of change. Or we might be scared to move to a new city or country because we're scared of change. But change doesn't depend on switching jobs or starting businesses or moving cities or countries. Everything changes whether we try to make change or not. The work we have today is not the work we'll have tomorrow. The place we live today is not the place we'll live tomorrow. Even the person we love today is not the person we'll love tomorrow, because people change too. You might think you're together with the same person for months and months, years and years. But if you step back, you see that they're changing as much as you are. I don't want to make any of this sound easy. It's very hard to accept that nothing lasts forever. I think we all crave permanence at times. And maybe it isn't clear what all of this has to do with our practice of meditation. These ideas can seem very abstract. But as I've been saying, our practice is all about paying attention, which is just another way of saying seeing things as they are. Meditation doesn't tell us what to believe or what to do, but it allows us to check our beliefs against reality by allowing us to see reality more clearly. And when we see reality clearly, what we see is change. And no matter how hard we search, we don't find anything unchanging. Of course, sometimes we feel that nothing in our life is changing. Sometimes we can get very bored with our lives, and yet we know that change is everywhere. If we aren't seeing the change, then we aren't paying attention. We've gotten lost in some distraction, some delusion. Because when we really pay attention, we see that every day is different. Every moment is different. And every time we experience one moment exactly as it is, we taste awakening. When we see that everything changes, change can become a bit less frightening. When we realize that everything is already changing, change becomes familiar. The thing we thought we were avoiding turns out to have been with us all along. Because even when we think we're avoiding change, we're just inviting different changes. We're never truly faced with a choice between change and no change. We're always choosing between different sorts of change. And sometimes seeing things that way makes for an easier choice. We realize that a choice that looks safe, that looks like it avoids change, is really just inviting a different change. Buddha taught that true liberation, awakening, comes from seeing the world as it is. We can only get so far by pretending. Eventually, reality catches up to you. I'm sure we all know people who are living some obvious lie. They're in denial about a terrible relationship, a terrible job, a terrible business, or whatever. And the truth is that denial can work for a time. Just like the Buddha's early years as a child, it's possible to be perfectly happy living in an illusion for a while. Eventually, the truth finds its way in. In the end, we have to live in the real world, the world of impermanence, of change. The sooner we accept that, the sooner we truly see that, the sooner we can be free. And we taste that freedom through practice. We take a few minutes, 5, 10, 20, and we commit ourselves for those few minutes to see the world exactly as it is. And that's what we've been doing together today. I've really enjoyed sitting with all of you today. It's really a privilege to be able to come to such a beautiful place, sit together with beautiful people. So thank you so much. And wherever you're going from here, that you enjoy your life and that you pay attention to it.